How Poppi built a cult brand by selling beliefs, not soda. Today I'm walking you through one of the smartest brand plays of the last decade. A company that didn't win by being healthier, tastier, or cleaner. It won because it understood how consumers think. And once you see the strategy, you'll never look at packaging, messaging, or brand identity the same way ever again. The company is Poppi, the bright, cheerful, prebiotic soda you've probably seen all over TikTok. It's also in Target and Instagram fridge tours. But here's the truth. Poppi's product is soda, but the brand is not. The brand is identity engineering disguised as a fun drink. This isn't a story about influencers or packaging tricks. It's a playbook built on psychology. And as we walk through it, think of this less like a case study and more like a practical guide. Because everything Poppi did, you can adapt into what you're building. Whether you're running a product brand, a service, or you're growing your own personal brand, the principles are honestly the same. We're gonna go through this in stages. Each one breaks down a different psychological lever that Poppi was able to pull, and after each stage, I'll show you exactly how a brand, including yours, can apply it without copying the aesthetic or even the vibe. See, the goal isn't to become Poppi. The goal is to understand what Poppi understood before anyone else. People don't buy products, they buy stories that feel like shortcuts to the identity they want. Okay, so let's begin where this entire strategy quietly took shape. Stage one for them is the hidden advantage. This stage is about how Poppi took something that felt new and made it feel safe. And when you look closely, this might be the smartest move in their entire brand system. See, when Poppi entered the market, the wellness beverage space was filled with drinks that almost bragged about how scientific they were. They leaned into words that felt complicated. They led with ingredients no one could pronounce. They assumed complexity essentially communicated expertise. But as we know now, that's not necessarily the case. So Poppi took the opposite direction. Instead of educating the consumer on microbiomes or explaining gut science, the brand filtered everything through the lens of familiarity. The drink didn't ask people to learn anything. It didn't demand belief. It didn't overwhelm. Instead, it blended one modern idea, prebiotics, with flavors that people already recognized from their childhood. Apple cider vinegar, root beer, grape soda, cherry limeade, orange. It's a subtle move, but it matters because familiarity creates instant comfort, and comfort lowers resistance. When something feels familiar, people don't overanalyze it. In fact, they trust it. That trust creates the foundation for belief, and belief is what lets a brand grow without any friction. Now, as a brand builder, here's where the lesson becomes useful. If your product introduces something new, anchor it in something familiar, because familiarity is the bridge that carries people to innovation without overwhelming them. And that can be the difference between interest and confusion. So for example, if you're launching a tech product, introduce it using comparisons your audience already understands. If you're releasing a supplement, frame it through benefits that they've experienced before. If your service model is different, describe it using language that matches something that they already trust. The takeaway here is really simple. When you offer something new, pair it with something that feels known. It keeps the customer moving towards you instead of backing away to figure out whether they understand what you're even selling. So as we move forward, you'll see how Poppi used the same idea, taking the unfamiliar and making it feel obvious in every other layer of the brand. So stage two is the visual trick. This next stage is about something most brands underestimate, visual tone. Not the colors, not the fonts, but the emotional setting that your visuals create the moment someone sees them. Poppi didn't just choose bright colors because they look fun. The real strategy was to create a visual environment that felt non-threatening. When a product looks light and approachable, people assume it's harmless. And when they assume it's harmless, they assign it more trust than it's necessarily earned. This effect doesn't depend on the drink being healthy. It depends on the drink looking like something that belongs in a positive, upbeat category. Poppi isn't packaged like a supplement. It's packaged like a treat. And that specific tension, the contrast between health message and playful design, it pulls people closer. But here's where it gets interesting, right? The design doesn't just feel friendly. It also feels modern, and modern equals current, which primes a consumer to believe that a product is part of a larger cultural movement. That feeling is powerful, especially among younger buyers who associate modernity with correctness. Now, if you're building a brand, here's how to use this without copying that same style. Think about the emotion that you want your visuals to create. Not the aesthetic, but the emotion. Pick a simple feeling that you want someone to experience in the first second of seeing your brand. It could be calm, it could be exciting, it could be energy, expertise, security, anything. Then design every visual around that emotion, not around what's trending in your industry, but around that emotion. Because this is the mistake that many brands, if not most brands, make. They imitate what they see instead of designing for a feeling. But the feeling is the asset. And Poppi understood this early on, and they built an entire brand world around a single emotional promise. This is fun. This is safe. You will like this. Right? The lesson that you can take forward is to choose the emotional container that your brand lives in. And every visual decision, from color to pace to packaging, even ad style, should then support that emotional promise. All right, now that we've covered familiarity and emotional design, the next stage is where Poppi's strategy shifts from surface to influence. Stage 3. Social proof as a cultural signal, not a metric. Okay, in this stage, we look at how Poppi used social proof, but not the way that most brands use it, with numbers and charts and testimonials. Poppi used it as a cultural anchor. Instead of relying on influencers to promote the drink, Poppi positioned itself as something that influencers already liked. And that creates a different type of effect when a creator showcases something as part of their lifestyle and not as a sales asset. It ultimately signals cultural belonging. It says, this is what people like us drink. And that message travels way further than any direct claim. This is why the brand grew through organic social behavior before it exploded through partnerships. People didn't just post Poppi because of the taste. They posted it because they aligned with how they wanted to be perceived. And that's the cultural proof, not product proof. And if you're building a brand, here's the part that matters to you. Social proof works best when it reflects identity, not numbers. So if you want people to talk about your product, make it something that signals something about them. Give people a simple, shareable way to show that they're part of the story. That could be the packaging, it could be an experience, it could be a phrase, it could be an outcome. It doesn't matter what form it takes, but what matters is whether sharing it signals something desirable. So brands can take this forward by shaping their product and service around a shareable identity cue. Something that says, I'm the type of person who uses this. People love being associated with products that elevate their perceived lifestyle. And now that social proof is part of that system, the next stage explains how Poppi positioned itself as something worth advocating for. All right, so stage 4, positioning the drink as a belief system. This stage is about how Poppi created meaning beyond the product. Because once customers believe a product represents something more than itself, they start to defend it. And when people defend a brand, that brand becomes part of their identity. Poppi achieved this by placing itself inside the wellness narrative without fully committing to the traditional wellness rules. It lived at the intersection of indulgence and improvement. The drink tasted like soda, but represented a smarter choice. And that positioning made it possible for customers to feel proud of buying it. And when someone feels proud of a purchase, they're going to talk about it. They integrate it into their routine. They recommend it, they rationalize it, they defend it against criticism because criticism at that point feels personal. This is the part of Poppi's strategy most brands miss. The product wasn't marketed as a beverage. It was marketed as a decision that reflected intelligence and awareness. Drinking Poppi communicates that someone is trying to make better choices without sacrificing the enjoyment that they're used to. It's a self-contained narrative of growth. Here's how you can turn it into something practical for your brand. Define what belief someone is expressing when they choose you. Not what they're buying, what they're saying about themselves through the act of buying. When you clarify that belief, you give your product symbolic value. And the symbolic value is more durable than functional value. So whether your brand centers around improvement or convenience, simplicity, confidence, creativity, or anything else, link the product to a belief that matters to the customer. That's how you turn a transaction into loyalty. So now that we've unpacked belief, we can move into how Poppi scaled that belief into a movement. All right, so stage 4, positioning the drink as a belief system. This stage is about how Poppi created meaning beyond the product. Instead, the product fit into habits people already had. Poppi didn't ask consumers to give up soda. It gave them a version of soda that made them feel better about that habit. That's a subtle difference, but it changes everything. Because when your product attaches itself to an existing routine, there is no friction. The friction disappears. Brands often try to persuade customers to create new habits, but new habits are difficult. Change is difficult. Poppi removed that entire barrier by offering a substitute behavior instead of a new behavior. Here's what that means for other brands. Anytime that you anchor your product to an existing habit, you streamline the customer journey. That can look like this: attaching your service to a workflow people already use, aligning a digital product with a familiar pattern, linking a new experience to something they already do daily, placing your brand inside a moment they already understand. When you reduce behavioral friction, you reduce the emotional effort required to adopt your product. And that makes growth way more efficient. So now we've looked at familiarity, design, social proof, belief, and behavior loops. The final stage ties everything together by exploring how Poppi shaped its message to fit a changing culture. Stage 6, the cultural timing advantage. This stage focuses on timing itself, not luck, but alignment, really. Poppi entered the market during a cultural shift towards functional drinks, gut health awareness, and even playful wellness. Rather than building a brand against culture, Poppi positioned itself inside the cultural movement. But here's the part that makes this useful for your brand. Poppi didn't create the trend. It interpreted the trend in a way that people hadn't necessarily seen before. So the drink didn't use fear-based marketing. It didn't shame soda drinkers. It didn't pressure customers. It met them where they were already at and then offered a version of soda that aligned with the new cultural values. Brands can take this forward by analyzing what cultural shifts they sit inside. Not trends, but patterns. Patterns around identity and aspiration, even discomfort or optimism, or even lifestyle changes. Then interpret those patterns in a way that feels new, but doesn't necessarily ask the customer to abandon who they already are. Cultural alignment gives a brand momentum without forcing it. And when you pair cultural alignment with the psychological tactics that we've covered, familiarity, emotional design, social identity, belief systems, habit substitution, you create an environment where the product feels like the obvious choice. And that's the system that Poppi built, a product that feels obvious. Now that we've walked through how Poppi built a brand on psychology instead of soda, here's what matters most for you. This wasn't about packaging, like we said at the beginning. It wasn't about influencers. It wasn't about one clever tactic. It was a layered system. Every part supported the next. And when you build your brand the same way, with intention instead of improvisation, momentum becomes a lot easier. So take one piece of this and apply it today. Maybe it's the familiarity anchor. Maybe it's the emotional design rule. Maybe it's reshaping your social proof to reflect identity instead of numbers. But choose one lever and put it into motion. Because when you start building with psychology in mind, the market becomes less about competition and more about clarity. And clarity makes customers feel understood. And a customer who feels understood stays with you for longer. If you want more breakdowns like this on how brands use psychology to influence what people buy, stay tuned because I have a lot more coming your way.